Howdy my friends and welcome to the channel today. I'm Luke, Thunderhead289 here on YouTube, and today I'm breaking one of my rules where I generally just don't work on other people's vehicles. A lot of people ask me to, and if I started to do that I'd just be way too busy. But I made an exception today for this really nifty, I'm not sure what year this is, fridge front end, but anyway, really cool panel truck, and I'll get into the story here on why I decided to go ahead and work on it. So with that, let's take a look at the truck and then see if we can fix these issues and succeed where 3 or 4 other mechanics could not. So with that, let's jump in. So I want to say that this is a 59, 60, 61 panel truck, and as you all know, panel trucks are exceptionally rare. They kind of existed before vans, and they were service vehicles. People used them for different businesses, and that's what my now good friend John here had used this rig for, or what he had intended to use it for, and a little bit more on that story here in a moment. But it sports a 351 Windsor and C6 transmission, not original to the truck, but it's got some issues in there. And just opening the hood, there's a few blaring things that we'll get to in a minute that are probably causing a lot of problems. But he's had the truck for 10 years. He bought it back in the Craigslist days. It was a purple or something, and primer, and he painted it up real nice, and he actually had intended to use it as a work vehicle. It's not a show rig. He actually uses the thing. So pretty nice interior, and different things. And he would basically, it's a catering service, and he would hook his grill to the back of the rig, or had intended to, and then, kind of go about his business like such. So why I opted to help him is this is just a great dude, all right? Now, this is a guy that I have an incredible amount of respect for. A lot of people that do cool things in life or build things like this business, this truck, they come from money. They're born with a silver spoon in their mouth. They just have naturally a lot of opportunity. That doesn't make them bad people, but it's really something special when someone comes from nothing and they build up something like this. It's just very difficult to do. So, if you remember, my wife and I 4 years ago lived in a trailer park, and so we kind of have some of the idea of the sacrifices you have to go through. So my heart goes out to people like this when they have big aspirations for this vehicle. He spent a lot of time trying to put it together, put his faith in other people to get it right as far as the engine and driveline, which I kind of specialize in, and it's never really worked out. So the bleeding heart in me, I guess, I just couldn't sit by and watch that happen. When he mentioned he thought about selling the truck, I thought, nah, we're not going to do that. We're going to get it right. Now, on my quick once over here, not noting the electrical that looks like it could be precarious, but I think it's all right. I noticed over here a ballast resistor, and then this looks like it would have been a points distributor, but I'll fire it up for a moment and you'll hear it kind of, if we can get it to kind of cough to life. But I'm willing to bet that this has a retrofit, and that's some of our issue, let alone you can see the vacuum advance. And this is an old stock unit, has a vacuum retard here going to this thermostatic deal that isn't hooked to anything on the carb, so no functional vacuum advance at the moment. And right there, that's probably one of a few blaring issues I've noticed, is it has a Protronics ignition module, and it's tapped right here off the coil. And with that ballast resistor over here, what's going on is basically that ignition module has probably been running under voltage for a long time. It'll work at first, but then it starts to have issues. When we fire it up here, you'll kind of hear it. So that's something we're going to have to address, let alone all this other stuff. All right, let's try and fire this thing up. I never have anything that has decent paint. You can see my dang reflection in the thing. You can all see that I use a cell phone to record, so when you all complain about the, why, So that's going to be precarious. Oil was changed with 5W20. I'm not super privy to doing that. Well, off to a good start. Oh yeah, it's got this thing where this is some of the electrical thing that I'm going to look into just while it's here. And there it goes. It's something with the neutral safety switch thing. Anyway. Not great. Yeah, so I think I'm done doing that before I destroy the thing. So I think we need to get a look at our ignition because it seems very much so related to that, and it's weak, and when it does kind of fire, it now reeks in this garage. So, you know, all sorts of not good stuff is going on up there. This grill has a very unique personalized detail to it that I thought was pretty interesting, and I've been trying to figure out the switches to figure out how to turn it on, and I think it's this one. So let's take a look here. Now I turned the lights off here so you can see this thing, and a keen eye might have already have noticed this, but we can shut this hood. It's a million billion pounds here. So you might have noticed that instead of Ford it says food, and then he put some lights in it, so it's like a grill. So I don't know, I thought that was a pretty neat, kind of tasteful, personal touch, and I need both arms to lift this thing up. Holy cow. They really built them with some heavy metal back in the day. Now diving into our ignition here, which I believe to be the root cause of the issue. There's issues with the carburetor also, but it would at least fire up decent, which it clearly cannot do very well. So, you know, the mechanics, I was told, had a really hard time with the ignition. They couldn't find the timing pointer. I found it here. You got to have a keen eye for it, but you know, modern day mechanics just struggle with ignition timing. They get in here, they windmill the distributor all over the place and just cause a lot of problems, and it's just too bad. So let's see if we can get this squared away. And oh, also really cool thing about this whole deal. Now I could just fix what's in there right now, but I view the stock Ford ignition system to be fairly undesirable. Not to mention the Pertronix retrofit module is probably burned out at this point from the incorrect way that it was wired with the resistive lead and all. So I called on my good friends Pertronix when I saw the photos of this thing and said, hey, you know, I don't want the fellow to have to pay for stuff. I want it to be as good as it possibly can, you know. And so they donated a nice Pro Billet Igniter 3 distributor for this thing. And after seeing what it's got going on anyway, I'm glad I did because, you know, junk. So if you look down right in here, you can see that little flat right at the end of my flashlight, and that is the timing pointer. Now, the harmonic balancer is going to be pretty difficult to see, so that's going to give us some issues. I have a good feeling. But we need to get this thing to top dead center to prepare to pull this hunk of junk out of here. Now, a common mistake when dropping in a distributor is to get it 180 degrees off. The crank rotates twice to every one time the cam rotates. So, you know, and this is really easy to avoid. And in this case, it should be easy to figure out just because this engine does run, can run. So all that aside, I assume that cylinder 1 is at least somewhat close here. So when our rotor points to our spark plug wire number 1, so I'm going to make a little mark here so we can see where that is. Pop this off. These Ford distributors are always good for snapping your fingernails off. And when this rotor is pointed at that point, we know that that is our actual TDC mark. We're on top dead center of the engine. And I do not love leaning over the fenders of this car. Hang on here. Now, as well as Pertronix, which donated the distributor, I called on my good friends at Edelbrock to weigh in here, and I got something pretty special for this truck. You notice that's a 2-barrel and this is a 4-barrel. So, you know, we're going to do some fun stuff. But they also sent a menagerie of things here. So some nice fender covers, which are going to come in very handy for this truck. I wonder where my Chevrolet repair kit went. Anyway, I'm just used to working on cars like this where my big old belt buckle here, you know, doesn't, I think I just dented it, but my big old belt buckle, you know, it just doesn't matter. Anyway, we don't want to be doing that stuff to this truck. So I got our 15/16 wrench on here. And if you can see down in there, probably not as well as I can, I'm just going to rotate the engine. You see the rotor moving here. So we're waiting for that to line up, and then we know when to be looking for the timing pointer. I have a feeling it's going to be very hard to see, as it always is. All right, so I did find it, and you guys probably can't even see it because you have to squint your eyes to like level 1000 to be able to see. It's been painted over. It was a rusty balancer probably originally. So one really handy thing to do is to mark that TDC mark. Now, you're not going to see the timing marks anywhere else on the harmonic balancer just because it's so old and corroded. And so, you know, that's some of the reason people just, they never care about ignition timing. They always blame carbs. Carbs are forgiving, even though this one is not great. But most of the time, carburetor issues are actually ignition timing issues. So I have very precariously marked TDC on the balancer. You can see it here. It's the white line in the center of your screen. So at least we can do some worthwhile ignition timing things now at this point. Now we can pretty inconsequentially pull the distributor without a whole host of debacleville ensuing. Granted, Ford distributors like to get stuck in the engine, so, you know, hopefully we don't have to break the slide hammer out. I've had to do that one before. Now I know what a lot of you big brain folks who generally that's who watches this channel are thinking when they see that TDC mark, and that, you know, that's all well and good for dropping in a distributor, but that's not really going to help you for ignition timing. And I agree with you in most cases. Most people have a standard style timing light, and when they have scenarios like this, then they just play glorified guess and check, which I'm sure the previous mechanics did, and you know, it's always going to be suboptimal. You think carbureted engine, you think the carburetor, you know, you never think about ignition timing, but the biggest gains in an engine come from very well-tuned ignition timing, and it's always ignored, forgotten, set on the side. And so, because it's difficult, I mean, you can see like it would be hard. Now with a dial back timing light, which you guys see me here use on this channel, all you need is that TDC mark. But the big problem is these timing lights, you know, I do a lot of this stuff, so I have one. They're like $138, you know, $200, whatever. They're expensive. And so in an attempt to give back to the community that's done so much for me here, you know, and understanding that those are expensive and no one likes to do that, Joe and I with Carb Cheater kind of came up with a dial back timing light that's affordable, that does all the same stuff, and then, you know, basically it just makes your life a whole lot easier and for an affordable price. So these are on our website right now, and I'll leave the link below, but you'll see just how darn effective these things are at getting ignition timing set up well. Total timing, initial timing, everything. You can do a lot with these, and you can do a good job at it. Now, I'd assume this engine didn't have a timing pointer or timing marks on the balancer or something based on the intel from the previous mechanics. Now, instead of flying blind like they did, and obviously not succeeding, you can very easily, if that were the scenario, use a piston stop and again, get a top dead center point. But I'll save you all from rehashing that video today, but I'll leave the link below on the in-depth video of how to do that. It's super simple, and in the end of the day, you're not windmilling the distributor all over, just looking like a complete chump. And as far as I know, no one wants to be a chump. All right, everything is unhooked from the distributor, and hopefully Lady Luck shines on us here, because Fords are always terrible about this. Oop. You always want to check that you're not going to have anything fall in the engine when you pull this up. It's very typical. Using up all my good luck, I think. There she is. The ugly, probably worn out, and very difficult to tune stock unit. You'll hear me rag on Fords a lot, and I have Fords, so, you know, Ford fanboy maybe, but that doesn't mean that I can't be honest about the things that Ford did bad. And their distributors are definitely one of them. So comparison here between the Igniter 3 Pro Billet Distributor and the stock Ford unit, as you can see on the Ford, and this is the part that I very much so dislike about them, is all the advance and recurve, and all of that is under the advance plate. So it takes a lot of disassembly, which isn't impossible to do, but because it's so annoying, no one does it, and Ford engines typically suffer from terrible ignition timing because of it. And I'm looking at you, Duraspark people. You are just married to your factory Ford stuff, which is terrible. But on the Pertronics, everything's up top. You have advanced limiters, so initial timing, total timing. You can change the springs easily, so you can get these very much so dialed in. A lot of people think electronic ignition is just about how hot the spark is, but you know, that's a piece of it, but the biggest advantage comes from tuning the thing. Now the Igniter 3 is extra specials as a built-in rev limiter and multi-spark and everything, and it's really easy to install. And I'm not just saying that because I got this one for free. 64 Galaxy Pertronics Igniter 3, 20,000 miles, no issues whatsoever, runs amazing. Pertronics HEI Igniter 3, 70,000 miles on this unit, runs amazing, never had any issues. 1974 5-speed F100 Pertronics Igniter 3 Pro Billet Distributor, been in here for 12 years and I've never had any issues. So suffice it to say, obviously pretty darn good stuff, good equipment, and a great upgrade to your Ford or your Chevrolet or whatever, but especially on Fords because Ford ignition from the factory is just terrible. So dropping in the distributor here, we want to know where cylinder 1 is because we want the rotor to line up with that when everything seats down and meshes. So I kind of like my vacuum advance coming out at just such an angle towards the front of the engine, and the plug wire arrangement works really well on a Ford if cylinder 1 is plugged into the back of the distributor, if not a little biased to the driver's side. So I'm just going to make a mark here because this is the lug that I want to be cylinder 1. So basically when we drop it in at TDC, we want that kind of the rotor kind of pointing at this spot on the body. Obviously we'd have the cap off so we can't see that, and so a mark and we can see what we're doing. Now Pertronics uses what is called a melanized gear, so it actually works for roller and flat tappet, which this engine is a flat tappet, at least that's the distributor that was in the thing, had a cast gear, so you don't have to worry about that as much with Pertronics, which is very nice here. So we're just putting some assembly lube on everything so it slips in nice. It's kind of a weird thing to say, but dropping this thing in here, it's probably wishful thinking that the oil pump drive is going to line up. Another classic Ford issue. But we want to, here so you guys can see it, you know, our marks here, we want to pre-clock our rotor because as it goes in and meshes with the cam, it's going to rotate. So if we line that up and drop it in, it's going to phase shift in the wrong direction. So you're going to want to pre-clock it counterclockwise, and as it meshes, it's going to line up with your mark here. It's not really any such thing as a tooth off, but that's probably where the phrase came from. So I want to have my vacuum advance pointed this way here so I have a good amount of adjustment when I do go to make adjustments. Okay, we got super lucky. So if your distributor is hanging like such, there's a few things you can do when you're trying to drop it in. The one that I don't like is you can bump the key and it'll slightly move that oil pump drive, or the distributor rather, and it'll fall in. I don't like that as it just messes everything up you're trying to do. Or you can get a socket down in there and turn the thing. Which the socket method, taped on extension, is definitely my preferred way to do it because it's safe. You can't have any issues, but this dropped in nice and we're looking pretty good. And something else I just noticed that was fairly undesirable and probably led to the untimely demise of this ignition module. Not only was it on a resistive lead, but on top of that, the electric choke was also powered from it. So all of this was Zeusing the voltage down low where this thing couldn't do its job right, and you know, they just kind of burn up and don't work well. But it's misleading because they kind of run, but obviously, as you can see with the truck, not great. So, you know, I'm really not big on running the choke to the coil. It's really easy to do, but I mean, you're just Zeusing power out of your ignition. It just doesn't seem like a great idea to me. Now, if you go the Pertronics route, which I highly recommend, which is why I asked Pertronics for one for this project, for this guy, you know, you want to make sure you don't cheap out and you want to get the coil. Looks like they had the right one in here for things, but with the Pertronics Igniter 3, you do need the low resistance Igniter 3 coil for the module to work correctly. So we're just going to slide this back into this super ghetto chrome thing that hurts me to look at. Now, I know you astute people have probably already figured this one out. Now, I did ask for the female cap from Pertronics, but as you can see, this is a male cap, and that's a female cap. So I have a couple of options, aside from going to the parts store, which is like an hour away, all of which undesirable. So let's see what car we're going to steal stuff from, I suppose. Now, I know I could just take this cap off, switch it with this one, get some new plug wires for the 64 Galaxy, but then it kind of leaves me with these hideous, ugly, terrible wires that are on this engine as it sits. So our other option is going to hurt me more, but I think it's what I should do. So let's go for a little trip. Well, I was coming down here to steal the plug wires from the F100, but then I said to myself, you know what has really nicely loomed plug wires that would look great in that truck? The Supercharged 65. So, you know, that's a reasonable thing to do. Ah yes, only a distributor away from running. Now it's going to be plug wires and a distributor away from running. It's getting farther from being able to run instead of closer, but oh well. I feel bad doing that. These were really nice cut-to-length units that I had set up really good for this car, so thank you for your service to God and country, I suppose. Conveniently, the 65 Galaxy has a comp cam XE266HR, so long story long is it uses the 351 Windsor firing order, same as our engine here, so I should be able to just lick and stick these plug wires on, which is extra convenient in an inconvenient way. Definitely not going to be sad about getting rid of these ugly wiring loom things. That's for true. Well, that was mildly painful to do. I didn't love taking those off the 65, but I will say they look good in here. These 302, 351 Windsor Ford engines, they're just small, especially in an engine bay like this. And looming the plug wires in front of the cylinder heads makes the engine just look a little bit bigger. That and T-handles, you know, little tricks not to make it look like a little baby Ford engine. But I don't know, they look good in there, so, you know, I suppose there's that. And in my opinion, it's a lot better than stuff draping over the valve covers all haphazard, cattywampus-like. So, you know, if for nothing else, they at least look good. I wouldn't call myself a plug wire snob, but there's just some things where I draw the line. So I like when the plug wires come out straight from the distributor, and I couldn't do that because of the way the coil was sitting. So I had to clock the distributor different from the way that I would like. So obviously you see here it's stabbed in pretty nice. And of course I had to take the distributor back out, slide it back in, slide this in, you know, turn the hex. What is this, 11-30 seconds or something on a 351 Windsor. But you also, you know, it's just not a good idea to have your coil sitting like this anyway. It's submerged properly in a vertical configuration, and ultimately I just think it looks better. You know, the engine, when you look at it from the top, just looks more arbitrarily symmetrical. So Anyway, we got all that done. It stabbed in. When I stabbed it in, it's probably like 5-10 degrees advanced is what I was looking at when I dropped it in. So it should fire right away. That's kind of one of my tricks that I do. I've shown that a lot. I just won't bore anyone with that here. And I've also looped the resistive lead. So it's on a full 12 volt. Choke is unhooked. Choke is adjusted so it's all the way open. So it's not just sitting there closed. And now we will try and fire it. I've done this so many times, I'm probably getting a little overconfident that things will just work, but you would think after as many times as I've done it, you just know what you're doing, maybe. Well, it actually starts and runs and idles. Wow, imagine that. If your ignition works, the engine runs. All right, let's do some ignition timing things and get our initial timing set. Runs, but I can tell, you know, when you stab it in and you think you're at 8, you might be at 18, you might be at 28, you don't know, but it gets you pretty close that way. Obviously it runs, so it must be doing something right at this point. So initial mechanical ignition timing is, you know, within the realm of reasonability. 16, that's enough for it to run. I'm just trying to get my bearings now that I see it running and see what is and what isn't. So I think the ignition's okay for now. Obviously we need to tune the vacuum advance, actually determine proper initial ignition timing, and I'll show you how to do that shortly. But the thing that's kind of concerning me here is, if you remember, it has this 520 in it. And this engine isn't even warm yet. Check out this oil pressure. Now, as an engine warms up, the oil pressure is naturally going to drop as the oil gets thin. But I mean, we're not even warm yet, and we're already at 25 PSI at idle. And we're idling pretty high right now, you know. Big surprise with the carb settings with the ignition actually working. It's got the heavy advanced springs in it that aren't even good for anything, and it's still pretty snappy. It's amazing. It's going to get a whole lot better, I can tell you that much. Alright, so we have our vacuum gauge hooked to the ported timed port, and disregard what some people would call blow-by. Any engine is going to do this on warm-up without a PCV valve, so I will put a PCV valve on it because this is just absurd. But anyway, a vacuum gauge hooked to the ported timed vacuum port here. You can see we're not at 0 inches of mercury, and that's what you're supposed to have at idle on the ported port. So with our high idle right now, obviously we can get away with dropping the curb idle. And you can see when the curb idle drops, it closes off the exposure of this port and vacuum drops. And so you might say, well, okay, now my RPM's too low. But this is kind of how the engine tells you what initial ignition timing it wants. So if the RPM is too low, then you advance your initial mechanical ignition timing. And so when you advance timing, RPM will recover. So it's a balancing act between the curb idle screw and initial ignition timing, but that's an easy way to determine what the engine is asking for, which in this case, it looks pretty good at 15 to 18, somewhere in there. All right, that's been fun, but I'm tired of getting oil fumes in my eyes and in my lungs, and the thing smells real rich, so we need to do the mix screws. But since we're adding a PCV valve, which any engine should have, it's going to affect the idle air fuel ratio, so we're going to want to put this on first before we do the mixed screws, which we're going to do right now, because dang. And before we shut it down here, I just want to give you a good look at, you know, we're up to temp here, but check out the oil pressure. I'm amazed it has any at all, to be honest. I thought it would be at 0 with this 520 in it. Whoever put this in was, you know, not a genius. Now, it's common sense to use the rear breather as your PCV location. Again, PCV, positive crankcase ventilation. It's going to draw air in from here all the way across the engine and then out of the engine and then consumed by the engine, I suppose. But it helps for ring seal and getting the moisture out of the oil. And it's really something that you do want to run. Some people like to think of it as an emissions thing, and it isn't. It's actually, you know, I'll even go as far to put them on old carbureted stuff, or else you just have breathers that smoke and all this other tomfoolery that isn't any fun. But I use a late 80s, early 90s Chevy truck TBI PCV valve, and they work really good with carbureted stuff. And of course, we're going to hook it to the back port of the carb, which is a centralized port. Oftentimes I see people do something silly where it's going to an intake runner, so don't do that. Go into the rear port of the carb. That is in fact what it is for. And I'm really appreciating this 200-degree thermostat that someone really thought they needed. Completely absurd. You know, I like 180 degrees. It gives you room where if you have a runaway issue, you know, you can kind of handle it before you cause engine damage. And generally stuff will run around 190 anyway in that case. So 180 is totally good. 200, you know, you're just going to start to have carb issues when you get some excessive underhood heat, kind of associated with those thermostat ranges, like a 195. So anyway, that's my monologue on thermostats. And all right, I expect it to be like Linus McGuinness now. Oh, got to jiggle the shifter. That was probably an image y'all didn't need. Definitely like a step function leaner because a PCV valve is a controlled vacuum leak essentially. Should probably wash my hands before I get in here again. Now obviously we have to retune our mix screws, but I want to point out something interesting is this fan is not running. It's a good thing we haven't spent a whole lot of time running this thing, and I've been good thing I was watching the oil pressure because it, you know, I've been watching the temp also. So it's interesting is I thought it just ran all the time, because check this out. It's on right now. But as soon as I start the engine, it is no longer on. So make sense of that one. It's probably pretty important. Who knows how many times this engine might have went into meltdown mode. So that's too bad. Have to imagine it's at least overheated once or 10 times. A little sleuthing here has revealed my nemesis. If you've watched my channel before, you know I don't love electric fans. Now I have one on the Maverick because it's so tight with the V8, but if I can have a mechanical fan, I tend to do so. And these are some of the reasons why. You know, in the Maverick, you have to manually turn it on, and there's no weird tomfoolery to cause you trouble like we have here. So the fan's running right now, and so I kind of trace this line from the thermostatic switch, the electrical from the fan. It comes to one of these stupid things, which always have 1,000 issues, and then you overheat your engine. Obviously, it's this deal, so it's reading in the temp. It's probably just a binary switch where, you know, 1 or 0 at a certain temp it kicks on. Obviously, it's being stupid. I'm not sure exactly why when I bump the starter, it turns off. So looks good and corroded, that's what you want. But the relay is working, so I'm not worried about that so much. So, but you see it running here, I'll just bump the starter, that thing will be off. Never seen something like that quite like that before. So we go boop. Key is still on, everything is still on. and the fan has shut off, which it probably does anytime the engine is running. So, you know, that's mildly horrifying. So this is double fused, which is kind of interesting. Power going into this module is fused, power coming out of the module is fused, which is, again, just a double fuse. This looks like it's the signal to whatever IC is controlling this. And so anyway, then it's this orange wire that's going back into the cab. Lord willing, we don't burn the battery down. So normally this would be a complete headache, and it still might turn out to be. But it's got this really nice wiring deal in it. An electric fan, it's an orange wire, so I'll bet you that's the one. So we need to figure out why we're losing power here when we bump the engine. So I got the multimeter on here. We're probing to see if that signal is dropping out or what's going on. It's either this fancy pants McGee thing or the other fancy pants McGee thing under the hood, which this I'm okay with. Definitely that thing under the hood. You know, I have plenty of experience with those not working correctly. So key on, you don't hear the fan because I've pulled the relay out at this point so we don't run the battery down. 12 volts. Okay, now we're going to bump it. Same thing we did before. And we still have 12 volts. So probably the amp load when you turn the starter basically shunts the IC that's in this guy here. Where are you at? In here. And then, you know, it's curtains, and until you power cycle it again, which reboots that thing, basically the fan never comes on. Splendid. So I've asked the owner if I can cut a new relay module in there, and I haven't heard back from him. So for the meantime, we're just going to do one of these numbers. I've basically removed the relay and just made a jumper bypassing the relay in that entire circuit. So now, if we bump the key, hopefully the fan stays on. And it does. That's what we want to see. Good deal. At least we're not going to burn it down. And obviously with the engine off, we're just going to unhook that, and it's business as usual. Anyway, back to what we were doing here with the carb and the PCV valve. Now I got the truck running here again, and you'll remember that when I put the PCV valve on, it really started to struggle. Now, what I'm going to show you is something that I would normally do before I refire everything, but I didn't want to do it just because I know that there's going to be something just wild about the mix screws. So a clear indicative thing here is you can see that PCV valve fluttering. That's a clear sign of this issue. But basically these mix screws are not even. So I'm going to shut it down, and we're going to count these off, and we're going to set them at a decent starting point. And I guarantee you it's going to run a whole lot better, and that PCV valve won't be fluttering like that. You can tell it just kind of sounds uneven. So apparently the PCV valve was enough to kind of throw everything over the line. So got our handy dandy screwdriver here, and this is going to be exciting. Now mix screws are supposed to be adjusted evenly, and I have a pretty good idea that these aren't. Just again, that PCV valve acting the way it does was pretty indicative of that. Now remember, this has been to 3 mechanics before it's been here. And so we're just gonna go until they're all the way seated. So here's our starting point. And it's already seated. So that was only a half turn out. Not great. Definitely on the lean side of things. And just out of curiosity, I'm so familiar with these Hollies that I kind of know from looking at the screw where it's probably at. And right there. So that was only a quarter of a turn out. So suffice it to say, not great. So what we're going to do, just as a starting point, is we're going to go 1.5 turns out. So there's a half, there's 1, and there's 1.5. We're going to do that to the other side here. And I bet you when we fire the engine, it's going to absolutely idle to the moon, because probably the fueling is still going to be, it's going to be rich, but it's going to be within the realm of reasonability. So here we go. I'm doing this all in one frame apparently. refire it here. It's all sorts of cattywampus now. There we go. Still pretty cold on the temp, so it's not atomizing fuel perfect, but I mean, look at the idle RPM and listen to how steady it is. Let's get our idle down here, because this is pretty egregious at this point. There we go. That's pretty reasonable. Sounds a whole lot better. Now this is going to be a rich setting, and the reason I go rich is because then we know to optimize everything, we just need to lean things up. So we'll take our vacuum gauge here, we'll stick it on our manifold port, or whatever's going on here. We'll get a proper manifold port, and then we can adjust our mix screws pretty darn well. And as a side note, you can see the PCV valve isn't fluttering whatsoever, just doing its job like it's supposed to do. So we're idling here with about 16, 17 inches of mercury. It's we know it's rich, so I'm going to go a quarter of a turn leaner, which is clockwise, and we're just going to go slowly here. So we're going to just keep doing this, and as we go, you can see the vacuum went up a little bit. We're going to go until the vacuum reaches its peak, highest point, the highest inches of mercury. And you can actually hear the idle RPM going up. I'm going to give it some revs to clean it out. We're still increasing. We're at about 18 now. A little leaner. Idle RPM is significantly increased. Vacuum went up a little bit, so that's probably where we want to be. I'll go another quarter of a turn leaner. And vacuum did not increase at that point. So what we're going to do, since we found the exact onset of our peak vacuum, we're actually going to go back a quarter of a turn richer, and this is what everybody forgets. Because when you shut the hood and all the underhood heat is at play, it's going to run leaner than the hood open, no air filter. So there we go. Vacuum is nice and happy. Our RPM is pretty good and high, but that's the thing that everyone forgets. You want to go a quarter or an eighth of a turn, excuse me, richer from your first highest vacuum onset. You know, you don't want to keep going and be like, it's not moving, you know. It's from the first onset of highest vacuum. Then you go an eighth of a turn richer, and you're going to be in pretty good shape. You can see we're idling at 900 now, so that's quite a bit for this engine. So we can reduce our idle a little bit here, and everything's good and happy. So much better. But now that we have a carburetor that runs and is happy, we can go back to perfecting our ignition stuff. And the first thing is going to be the advanced curve and the total timing. I often ask myself why I keep doing this stuff, because it takes a lot of time out of my life, and I do work a day job, but it's moments like this, it's just peak satisfaction. So on to recurving here. If you'll remember, we have 16 degrees of initial timing on this engine. So wish I had a notepad, but so if we're at 16 and this distributor adds 24 degrees, so I mean that would, come on brain, math, that would bring us to 40 degrees of total mechanical timing, which would be not ideal. And this is why stuff like the Pertronix is really handy. So, you know, you'd have to make a concession with initial timing to not have too much mechanical timing and all these dumb things with the stock Ford distributor over there. So instead of having to do all that weld and grind stuff, you have these nice stop limiters. So I know there's a set in here where I can limit it to 20 degrees of mechanical advance in the distributor, which 16 plus 20 would then be 36. So that is going to be pretty okay for this engine. It's a lower compression 351 Windsor, so you know, a little bit of extra total timing isn't going to hurt anything. And people always make fun of my they're called long nib markers, but I'll show you the advantage. Say you want to transfer a hole, boom, if I don't knock everything down, super easy to do. So a little bit of foreshadowing here with this 2 to 4 barrel adapter that I machined. But anyway, so we're going to get the advanced limiters in there, and then I think we can bring the timing in a little bit quicker. The other thing that the Pertronix comes with, which is really nice, and this is what I like about aftermarket distributors, okay? You know, the ignition, hot spark, all that's nice, but it's the ease of tunability. So since this thing goes down the road about 3,000 RPM at 70, you know, all those gear ratios and everything, this thing is not that heavily loaded. So we can take those really heavy springs out, and I'm going to change these so it brings the timing in by 2,800 to 3,000 RPM, all mechanical timing in. Oh no, I broke a fingernail. This is hard enough. You can imagine if all of this stuff was down inside the distributor, just how absolutely irritating that is, especially when you're working on it in the vehicle. So again, Pertronix stuff, really nice, all on top. Still difficult, but manageable. All right, we got everything on there. It looks good. So this timing curve should come in by about 3,000 RPM. And these look kind of hokey-majokey, but trust me, even the MSD, it uses a little bushing underneath, and you got to hold your tongue in your mouth just right and put tape on your wrench, or else the bushing, when you're changing them for the advanced stops, will fall into the distributor. It's just kind of a mess. So I really like Pertronix setup. It looks weird, but it works dang good. All right, everything's back in there. We're going to refire the engine. There we go. Nice, steady, smooth idle. Everything's pretty happy. Such an improvement. I'm super pumped with the recovery of this engine. I was kind of worried with the fan and everything that the engine had overheated. Some of the valves might have been messed up, but manifold vacuum is rock solid, dead steady, and it's got pretty good and high vacuum, so it's still a healthy engine yet. And I've known Windsors for a long time. I've worked on them for 15 years, and you know, they can take quite a beating and a lot of abuse and still be pretty darn healthy, which it definitely seems like we have a healthy engine here. And you'll notice that the truck is quite a bit quieter at this point, aside from the fan and the engine bay running, which is good and what we want. But you'll notice when an engine is tuned and set up halfway decent, it'll actually quiet down quite a bit, and the exhaust smell and everything virtually goes away. You know, it's completely comfortable to sit in this sealed off garage and work on the thing, which I'm going to open the door so I don't get asphyxiated, but at least, you know, it's not burning your eyes, and it's very tolerable, and that's a clear sign that things are good. Now, I'm sure most of you have noticed that I have yet to hook up my vacuum advance. Now, this is an adjustable vacuum advance canister here, and from the factory, I think with Pertronix, it adds 20 degrees of timing, and you can tell it's an adjustable one. It's got this hex deal. Now, back in the day, Pertronix did not do that, and I kind of have a bone to pick with them about that, because for the average person, that's actually a point of confusion where previously they had these, they added 15 degrees of timing, and it comes in about 8 to 12 inches of mercury, and that worked really well for most all engines. So this is one of those things where it's more capable, but for the average person, it's more difficult. And how we have everything set up, 20 degrees is going to be too much additional timing when we're cruising down the road. So we're going to want to try and reduce that to somewhere between 10 and 15. I'll show you how to do that here. So I've refired the truck here, and you guys probably can't see it, but I can. We're at about 15, 16 degrees of timing. So now I'm going to probably need 2 hands. I'm going to hook the vacuum advance to manifold vacuum, and then we're going to again check with a timing light and see how much timing that added. So we were at 15, 16, now we're at 35, 36. And you saw that, shut this fan off here, you saw that the engine ran noticeably rougher because, you know, it's excessive ignition timing. Now this is going to play into why I use timed and ported vacuum with how I tune engines. There's a lot of opinions, and I'll explain more why I do this the way I do it here in a moment. But anyway, let's adjust that thing so it's not adding so much timing, because 20 degrees, if you were imagining cruising down the highway at 35, you know, another 20 degrees, that is just excessive timing. And you're just going to prematurely wear an engine doing that. So it's not what we want. So what you need here is a little Allen wrench, and it looks like it's a 3/32. It's probably actually a metric, but I don't believe in using units that lost World War II. So American it is, and I believe counterclockwise here we have the tail facing up. We're just going to go 1/4 of a turn at a time. So I think counterclockwise reduces it, and you want to be careful if you get to a stop point and you really wrench on this thing. These are very easy to break. So we've made a slight adjustment. We're going to hook everything back up, refire it, and see where our timing is at this point. Nice thing also about the Pertronics is the adjustable vacuum advance has really good resolution, where a lot of them, they only have 6 turns from lock to lock. This one has quite a few more. I lost count, but going through everything, I got it down to 12 degrees of vacuum advance timing. And the reason I did that is, again, this is a 3-speed auto rig. When it's running down the highway, it's at higher RPM, 2,800 RPM or so. So I didn't want to add excessive timing, because I didn't want to have to sacrifice good mechanical timing, which is the timing you're on when you're at hard throttle. You know, the whole idea of vacuum advance is it adds timing at light throttle scenarios. And so when you tow into it, you're just on your mechanical timing. And if you compensate to have, you know, late mechanical timing to accommodate a vacuum advance, you know, you're just going to have a vehicle that doesn't perform well when you tow into it. So I opted to go with only 12 degrees of advance. Reason being, when it's at the higher RPM, you know, it's going to be at 47, 48 degrees of advance, which is still high, but not too terribly high, and well within the realm of reasonability at light throttle, what an engine will handle well. And if you check fuel injection cars, they do very much so the same thing with timing. Now, one thing you probably noticed when I was going through that is, because of my initial mechanical, when I would hook the vacuum advance up, the engine, even at 12, would still run rough. You know, that's excessive initial timing for what it needs on manifold vacuum, and this is why I run ported advance. Now, there's this internet lore thing that ported advance is an emissions thing, and that is just not true. So behind me I have the 64 Galaxy. Now, that was well before the era of emissions, okay? Some GM engineer said that, and no one even kind of ever confirmed his claim, or if he was an engineer, you know, I'm an engineer, and, you know, I've worked with stupid engineers before, and even if a guy said that, you know, you have to use your brain when you think about this stuff. So right here, I have the factory carburetor to this car. It's a 4-barrel Autolite, and it only has ported timed vacuum advance. Again, well before emissions, okay? So looking at our Autolite carb from 1964, you see the vacuum advance port for the distributor right here. And on our throttle, if we open it, you can see the timed or ported advance port. And you see when the throttle is at idle, that port is on the opposite side of manifold vacuum, so it sees no vacuum at idle. And so, you know, 1964, very much so before emissions, and this also existed in the 50s as well. So, you know, that whole emissions claim is really not very valid. So if you remember earlier, we were using the vacuum gauge on the ported port of the carburetor to see where the throttle is supposed to be. So obviously with ported or timed vacuum, it's supposed to be on the opposite side of the throttle blades at idle. So if you crank your curb idle screw too far and you start seeing a lot of vacuum on that port, you know that you have late initial timing. You need to advance that, which allows you to, again, reduce your curb idle screw and get that timed or ported vacuum port in the right orientation. So it's nice as even a secondary telltale because it kind of tells you where the engine wants to be with things. So, you know, definitely a very much so underappreciated thing on old school cars, and just a ton of lore on the internet that's just flat out wrong about it. So anyway, we got everything set up good, and now I'll hook our vacuum advance to our timed or ported port, and this will be a very solid running engine. Now I do acknowledge you're going to find some conflicting info with what I say here in this video, but what I want you to remember is not everything you read on the internet is true, and a lot of things you read on the internet is just regurgitated nonsense that's been perpetuated for years. The whole reason I do this thing on YouTube is to provide to you guys the info that I always wish I had, and the stuff that actually works and makes sense. And the way I go about ignition timing works exceptionally well. I promise you, if you try it, you'll just be like, wow. And don't even get me started on bringing your timing all in by 2500. If you want to ask me about that in the comments, I'm happy to explain it to you, but that's like a whole video in and of itself, and I have some really good reasons why I don't do that. So I think we're ready to fire it up and actually take it for a drive, and just look at the plug wires and the T-handles being all aligned. It just looks like much more formidable of an engine in there, and I'm resisting the temptation, but if you put a Hillborn scoop on something that looks like this, especially in a truck like this, so I might have to donate this to this project, because man, it's just going to look so good in there. But man, what a cool rig. Steering wheel feels like I'm driving a Mack truck here. Make sure we don't get T-boned backing out. No seat belts, so I suppose we die like men in this thing. All right. This B&M shifter here is kind of weird. So I believe that is drive. Off we go, finally. Now I'm a little on the tall side for this rig here. I'll put you at eye level for me. So it's like I'm cutting off half my view with the roof line. So if I just hunch down here, I can see where I'm going. Good thing the fellow who owns this isn't as tall as I am. All right, from a roll, we'll just tow into it here. You can see the automatic, how it shifts, you know. It spends most of its time in the low RPM, mildly horrifying, high center of gravity. Accelerates pretty respectably, I'd say. So far, a successful test drive. We're gonna wave to our good friend, the tank, because everyone needs one of those in their hometown. Looking pretty good, drives well. Sounds good, doesn't reek with oil fumes or fuel fumes, so I can dig it. Now this is the part where most people would say, okay, it runs really good, it's good enough, but this big 351 Windsor engine and everything, it has a lot more in it, and it's being seriously hindered by this 500 CFM 2-barrel that's on it. So this is where our good friend Edelbrock is going to come in handy here today. So not that it runs bad, but if you're not matching the CFM demand with the CFM supply, or at least relatively close, you know, you just lose all of your port velocity, and you know, that translates to not as good of acceleration or power as you could have otherwise. So if I just tow into it here, you know, it's not bad, but you know, there's definitely a lot more in it, okay? Everyone's always putting these 500 CFM 2-barrels on everything in it. They were made for circle track stuff, way high RPM. This automatic transmission doesn't even really get up above 3,500 full throttle before it shifts, you know. It's just a stock setup. That's what it's gonna do. So, you know, we're just really never properly meshing our CFM supply with our CFM demand. But not that it's not respectable here, it can really move out. I'm a perfectionist, and I know it can be notably better. All right, so we're back home here. We're idling in drive, a good 600 RPM idle here, and our temp isn't even high at all, you know, because we have our fan actually working, and look at our oil pressure. It is not good. Now remember, it has 520 in it, so I think I'm going to pull it in and we'll put some 1540 in it, and then we'll rectify this carburetor scenario that I'm super not a fan of. As one would expect, in classic Ford form, it hits right on the cross member. Granted, obviously this is a fabricated cross member to make the 351 work over the Y block or flathead that would have been in here originally. And hey, look at that, a Stone Temple Pilot's oil filter. That's a rare unit right there. So a short intermission here with some of the realities of living in a 110-year-old house with 30 to 40 some odd year old equipment. It's getting down to below 30 degrees in the evening and at night, and our furnace has decided to stop working. So we're gonna try and, I guess, troubleshoot this and figure it out. From living in a trailer, I had to deal with this stuff all the time. So luckily, I'm pretty good at putting my HVAC hat on, so let's see if we can fix this really quick and get back to working on the truck. So on a furnace, much like an engine in a car, you have an intake and an exhaust, and they both exit somewhere on the side of your house. We're going to ignore my very questionable foundation. And anyway, so they come in, the intake comes in, it has a draft motor which draws in air so that, you know, you can actually have oxygen to burn everything since you're burning at such a rapid rate. A couple of differential pressure switches that need to be satisfied for the next phase so that the valve can open, the igniter can go. You know, it has some different checks in it before it fires up for the sake of safety. Now, a lot of times you'll have a little indicator light and it will tell you what's going on. So oftentimes that's on the back of the cover here. And basically you kind of watch the sequence and compare it here. So I know that it's telling me that the pilot, which is not lit all the time, it's a self-igniting pilot, basically it's failing to light. So that's either because the pilot valve that ignites this tube is clogged, which we're on propane here, so we're out in the middle of nowhere, so that does happen, or the igniter itself has burned out, or it's just not getting hot enough to ignite that gas flow. So I'm going to do something pretty dangerous here that I don't recommend doing, but when this tries to kick on and run, I'm going to flick on the lighter, and if it ignites the pilot gas and then everything runs, then I know that the self-igniting pilot light deal is not getting hot enough, or there's something wrong with that. So exciting stuff. It's better than freezing to death though, and if you try and get someone out here to work on this stuff, I don't know, after 2020 it's just hard to get anyone to do anything. So you need to be self-sufficient if you're going to live out in the middle of nowhere like I do. So this will kick on here in a moment, we can test this out, but it's always a good idea to have spare parts for stuff like this, because you know, when your furnace stops working and it's really cold, it gets, you know, -10, -20 out here in Iowa, you are totally out of luck. So I have a spare igniter in case that is the issue, and I also have a spare draft motor. You know, if you can use tools, you can work on this stuff and be safe. Now, I'm not saying you should follow anything I do, as I'm not a certified HVAC guy, but I definitely know enough to be dangerous at this point. That trailer park living, it taught me a lot. So here it is, it started its sequence. It's trying to ignite. The differential pressure switches must be satisfied, so we'll jump in here very precariously. There it goes. So it looks like the igniter went bad. So basically it's got a temp sensor and an igniter. So when the igniter isn't getting hot enough, it won't ignite that very minute amount of gas flow. So looks like we got it here. I'm going to let it run its sequence, and then we will change our igniter and hopefully it runs on its own. So just a quick way to troubleshoot it that you definitely shouldn't do. Sometimes you can get lucky if this is the first instance of an issue. If you light the pilot yourself and then the main burners come on, those can kind of clean up, I suppose, that igniter. If it's got some deposits on it, it's not allowing it to get hot enough or whatever, and then it might start working again. But you definitely want to order yourself a new igniter if you see that, because you're definitely on borrowed time if that's the case. So it might work again, but once this runs its cycle, I'm definitely going to change it. So it's ran its cycle, it's got the house up to temp here, the status light reads good, everything is good. So before we remove all this, we want to make sure we kill the power to the furnace, which on mine is conveniently right on the side, because we don't want this trying to kick on when we have some gas lines detached. So now I'm going to unscrew this guy here and then unhook this, and we should be able to pull this assembly out. And it is very warm right now, what do you know? And get this thing weaseled out of here. There is your pilot light gas tube and pilot light orifice, your temp sensor, and your igniter. So that igniter looks like it's pretty dirty and carboned up, but we know that the pilot tube itself and the orifice isn't clogged because we're able to light this with a lighter. But I have had these plug up, and basically you can break this connection here and just spray out the orifice with legitimately carb cleaner. I've had to do it a number of times on propane especially, and you can get that fixed up. But hopefully I can just change our igniter here and put it back in and we'll be good. Which is as simple as popping this clip off, and these slide right out, and there she is. So the new one looks slightly different, but I'm hopeful it'll work here. Usually these come with a part number here that you can cross-reference because it is a wear item, and it's always a good idea, even if you're going to pay someone else to do this work, there's no guarantee that they're going to have the specific one for your furnace on hand. So again, you know, if you live where I am and it gets to like 0 degrees, you don't want to be out of luck. You're just better off having a spare one that you yourself or someone you pay to come out and do it can put in immediately. Because the alternative is that you have to set a timer on your phone for every 2 hours to come down here and light this thing by hand, or else your whole house freezes and your pipes blow. And it's a terrible experience, you know, very much so my experience from the trailer park life. Now, I'm going to save this one because I know the temp sensor is good. So if I do get into a situation, I still, with this one, if the temp sensor were to fail on this, which basically wouldn't satisfy the circuit, then it would never fire the main burner. At least with this one, I can light it with a lighter by hand if, again, the temp sensor on the new one were to go bad at some point. So some things to think about there. But with that, I'm going to get this thing thrown back in here and we're going to cross our fingers that it works. All right, all installed here, and you want to take great patience to make sure you don't cross thread anything dealing with the valve, especially a fancy pants McGee one like this, because then you'll be absolutely out of luck. So now flip on our furnace here and everything has a stroke for a moment until the processor comes online, and now we just wait for this thing to fire up and try and heat up the house and see if it works. So since I had previously lit it, we're already up to temp here. So let me just raise the temp so it has a higher target and tries to kick itself on here. Oh, and I just heard it click in. So we better hurry. And here it goes. Hopefully we catch it in time here. There goes the pilot light. And there goes the main burner. Think we're in business. All right, so crisis averted. We can get back to the truck here. Now, obviously, since I used my spare unit here, I'm going to order another one. So if this happens again, you know, I'm not out of luck. But in the meantime, like I said, I'm gonna hang on to this guy because I can still light this by hand if for some reason the replacement goes bad, which you don't think that would happen, but it does. I should probably say that everything I just did is probably illegal, but you know, illegal versus freezing to death and blowing all the pipes out of your house, I don't know. You can make your own decisions, but you just saw my experience there, and you know, maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't, but I don't know. Worked for me, I suppose. Responsive here, that real-time data comes in really quick. Snappy little engine. That Edelbrock is just doing great out of the box. So it's in the high 13s, low 14s.